The psychology of people who write endless to-do lists but never complete them. You have a list somewhere right now. Maybe it's in a notebook with a hard cover and clean lines. Maybe it's a notes app on your phone with 17 sublists nested inside the first one. Maybe it's on a sticky note folded in half and tucked into a pocket you haven't checked in 3 days. Maybe it's all three, plus a whiteboard, plus a voice memo you saved at 11 p.m. and never played back. The list is real. The list is detailed. The list has categories. Some of the tasks on it have little boxes next to them. Some of those boxes have check marks. And somehow, despite all of that, the thing you needed to do most is still sitting there, unstarted, waiting, watching you open a new notebook and begin again. From the outside, this looks like disorganization. It looks like procrastination. It looks like someone who can't get it together. But watch more carefully and something else becomes visible. You're not avoiding the work. You're doing something that feels remarkably close to the work. You're planning, you're organizing, you're preparing. And in that preparing, something happens in your body that feels almost indistinguishable from progress. That's not laziness. That's not a character flaw. That is one of the most quietly ingenious things your brain has ever learned to do. And this video is about why. Let's start with something that might feel a little uncomfortable to sit with. You're not failing at productivity. You're succeeding at something else entirely. The lists, the color-coded schedules, the perfectly organized digital folders for projects you haven't touched in weeks, these aren't evidence of dysfunction. They're evidence that your brain found a way to feel okay in moments when everything felt too heavy, too uncertain, too large to actually move toward. Before we understand why the list exists, we have to understand what it's protecting you from. Because the list isn't just a list. It never was. Think about what happens in the moment you sit down to write a list. There's something almost ceremonial about it. You find a pen that feels right, or you open a fresh document, or you fold a piece of paper in half. There's a moment of quiet, a moment where everything you haven't done is suddenly organized into something you are actively doing. You are preparing. You are taking the chaos in your head, the swirling, overlapping, unfinished weight of everything, and you're putting it somewhere outside yourself where it can be seen. And the second it leaves your head and lands on paper, something relaxes. That relaxation is real. It's not imaginary. Your nervous system, which had been quietly registering all of those incomplete tasks as low-level threats, small signals of danger scattered across the background of your day, suddenly receives a message. You know about it now. You've acknowledged it. You've contained it. And for a few minutes, sometimes longer, the alarm quiets. Psychologists sometimes describe this as the Zeigarnik effect working in reverse. The brain is famously uncomfortable with incompleteness. Unfinished tasks linger in the mind, pulling at attention, creating a kind of cognitive background noise that's exhausting, even when you're not consciously aware of it. Writing the task down sends a signal that the brain no longer needs to keep track of it actively. It's been recorded. It exists somewhere real. The mental alarm can stand down. This is the first thing to understand about the list. It is, in a very literal neurological sense, a relief mechanism. It reduces the experience of overwhelm by giving the overwhelm a shape. And here's what makes that significant. When writing the list feels that good, when it genuinely quiets something that was loud and anxious inside you, the brain starts to associate the list writing itself with resolution. Not the completion of tasks, the writing of them. You didn't intend to outsmart yourself. But somewhere along the way, the preparation started to feel like arrival. There is something in the way that highly anxious people relate to planning that most people completely misunderstand. When you're carrying a significant amount of anxiety, the kind that runs quietly in the background of everything, the kind that has no single clear source, but makes everything feel slightly urgent and slightly dangerous, the future feels very different than it does to people who aren't carrying that weight. For someone with moderate to high anxiety, tomorrow is not just tomorrow. Tomorrow is a landscape full of unknowns, and unknowns register in the anxious brain as potential threats. What if you forget something? What if you're not ready? What if you mess it up? What if you attempt the thing and discover that you genuinely can't do it? That last one is the one that doesn't get talked about enough. Planning, in this context, becomes a form of protection against the most terrifying possibility. Not failure, but exposure. The revelation of a limit you didn't know you had. The moment when you try and find out that you were not as capable as you needed to believe you were, as long as the task remains in the future, As long as it's on the list and not yet attempted, that possibility doesn't exist yet. You are still, in theory, someone who will get it done. The planning phase is the only phase where you are fully competent. You haven't tried yet, which means you haven't failed yet, which means the version of yourself that can do this thing perfectly still technically exists. The list, in this light, is not about the tasks. It's about preserving the self-image you need to feel okay. This is not weakness. This is the brain doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is avoiding pain. Specifically, it is avoiding the very particular pain of trying hard at something that matters to you and coming up short. There is another layer here that sits underneath the anxiety, and it often goes back much further than you might expect. Many people who write endless lists grew up in environments where their competence was conditional, where love and approval were tied, even loosely, to performance, where failing at tasks, even small ones, carried some kind of emotional consequence. It might have been a parent who expressed disappointment in a way that lingered, a teacher who made an example of mistakes, a household where being behind meant something was wrong with you. In those environments, children develop a very precise and necessary skill, the ability to look like they are managing things even when they feel completely overwhelmed. The list is part of that skill. It is a performance of readiness. It says, I have this under control. It says, I am the kind of person who is on top of things. And it does this without requiring you to actually do the things, which is where the risk lives. What starts as a coping mechanism in childhood becomes a habit of mind in adulthood. The emotional logic remains even when the original environment is long gone. The brain that learned to perform competence rather than risk incompetence will keep performing competence, because that strategy was genuinely useful once. It worked. It protected something important. The child who made a detailed plan to show a difficult parent that they were trying, that child grew up, but they didn't stop making the plan. Let's talk about what the list actually gives you, because it gives you something real. When everything around you feels uncertain, and for a lot of people, the world has felt acutely uncertain for years now, not as a metaphor but as a lived daily experience. The list provides something that anxiety cannot, the sensation of structure. Structure is not just useful. Structure is, in a very deep sense, calming. The nervous system responds to predictability the same way it responds to physical safety. When something is organized, when the chaos has been sorted into named categories with clear edges, the body relaxes, not completely, not permanently, but enough. The list creates a container. It says, here are all the things, and they fit inside this space. They are not infinite. They are not spreading in all directions like a stain. They are here, listed, bounded, named. That experience of containment is genuinely stabilizing for an overwhelmed nervous system. And this is why some people make lists during the most stressful periods of their lives, not because it makes them more productive in those periods, but because the act of listing is itself a regulation strategy. It is the mental equivalent of a long, slow exhale. You might have noticed this yourself. The way a completely reorganized desktop or a fresh planner page or a cleanly rewritten list can make you feel, briefly, like everything is manageable. Not because anything has changed, but because you have re-established, in a small and symbolic way, the feeling that you are the one holding the container, not the container holding you. And now, here is the part that changes the picture entirely. The relief is real. The calming effect of the list is real. And it is precisely that reality that makes completion so hard. Because here's what most people don't understand about the endless unfinished list. It is not a failed attempt at productivity. It is a successful attempt at emotional regulation. And once you understand that, the behavior stops looking like dysfunction and starts looking like logic. Your brain found a way to feel better. It found a way that works fast, that works consistently, that requires no external resources, that can be done anywhere, and that produces no failure because the attempt never actually begins. Of course, the brain keeps doing it. Of course, it keeps reaching for the notebook or the app or the sticky note. Of course, the lists multiply and the completion stays low. You're not failing to be productive. You are succeeding, repeatedly, or reliably, at managing a nervous system that needs frequent soothing. The question isn't why you make the lists. The question is what the lists are trying so hard to protect you from. There's a particular kind of perfectionism that lives inside this pattern, and it's not the kind that people usually imagine when they hear that word. Most people think of perfectionism as caring too much about quality, as someone who rewrites things 17 times and never hands anything in. And sometimes it looks like that. But more often, for the people who make the lists and don't complete them, the perfectionism is quieter and more internal. It's not about the quality of the output, it's about the quality of the attempt. The fantasy of the list is that one day you will be in the right state to begin. You will be rested enough, focused enough, emotionally regulated enough. You will have the right block of time, the right energy, the right clarity. Everything will align, and then you'll start. And because you'll be starting from such a solid place, you'll do it well. This fantasy is not irrational. It comes from a genuinely reasonable desire to do things properly. But it has a structural flaw. That day very rarely arrives, because the conditions for perfect readiness keep shifting. Because the bar for ready enough quietly rises whenever you get close to meeting it. Because the brain that set the bar is also the brain that benefits from never clearing it. So the list grows, the tasks age, and in the background there's a growing accumulation of quiet guilt, not sharp, not overwhelming, just persistent. A low hum that says, "You should have done that by now. You know you should have." And the response to that guilt, sometimes it's a new list. Because a new list restores the feeling of about to begin. And about to begin is, at least for a little while, better than haven't started yet. Something worth sitting with is how differently this pattern feels at different points in a life. When you are young, early 20s, maybe even earlier, the endless list often carries a sense of ambition. The list is evidence of everything you are planning to become, the projects, the goals, the habits you're going to build. The list is a map of a future self, and writing it is a way of reaching toward that self, touching it, saying, "This is where I'm going." At that age, the incompleteness doesn't quite register as failure because there is so much time ahead. The tasks will get done. Eventually. Probably. The list is a document of possibility more than an inventory of obligations, but sometime in the late 20s or 30s something shifts. The lists start to carry weight they didn't used to carry. The same behaviours that felt forward-leaning start to feel like avoidance. The projects that seemed deferred now seem abandoned. The version of yourself who was going to do all those things starts to feel further away, not closer. This is often when people first become aware of the pattern as a pattern, when they start to notice that the lists have been accumulating for years without the tasks meaningfully decreasing, when the sense of being perpetually about to start becomes suffocating rather than optimistic. But this shift in feeling doesn't mean the behaviour has changed. It means your relationship to time has changed. The list is doing the same thing it always did. The emotional function is identical. What changed is that the cost of deferral has become visible in a way it wasn't before. And that visibility, as painful as it can be, is actually important, because it means something has clarified. The brain is less willing to accept the planning as progress trade. Something is asking for more. For a lot of people, the relationship between tasks and identity runs deeper than they realize. The to-do list is not just a record of things to do. It is, on some level, a record of who you believe you should be. Every item on the list represents some version of yourself that you're reaching toward. The person who exercises regularly, the person who keeps their inbox clear, the person who writes the book, finishes the project, calls their mother, repairs the thing that has been broken since last winter. These tasks are not just tasks, they are identity markers. Completing them would mean becoming the person who does these things, and that person is held in the mind as a kind of ideal, a version of the self that is organized, capable, consistent, in control. But here's the weight that nobody talks about. Holding that ideal in your mind as an uncompleted task is an act of perpetual self-comparison. Every time you look at the list, you're comparing your current self to a future self that is better. And while that comparison can sometimes motivate, far more often it just quietly confirms what the anxious part of the mind has always suspected, that you are not yet the person you should be. The list becomes, over time, less a productivity tool and more a measuring stick. And every morning when you wake up and the tasks are still there, you measure yourself against it and come up a little short. This is not a reason to stop making lists, but it is a reason to look honestly at what the list is for. Is it a plan, or is it a monument to the self you're still waiting to become? There is something tender and very human in the way that people return to their lists again and again, even when they know, on some level, that writing them doesn't move the needle. That return is not stupidity. It is hope. Every time you open a new page, there is a quiet, persistent belief that this time will be different. That this list, properly written, properly organized, given the right amount of thought and preparation, will be the one that actually translates into action. The brain keeps returning to the strategy not because the strategy has been working in the way you intended, but because it keeps working in the way you need. The relief is real every time. The calm is real every time. The sense of possibility, brief, conditional but genuine, is real every time. And so you come back. You rewrite the same tasks in a new format. You download a new app with a slightly different interface. You buy a planner that has daily, weekly and monthly views and a section for goals and a section for reflection. You start a new document and title it something slightly different from the last one. Not because you're fooling yourself, but because something in you keeps trying to find the arrangement of words and structure that will finally make the doing feel as safe as the planning. That is not a failure of will. That is the evidence of someone who cares very deeply, who wants very sincerely, and who has not yet found a way to bring the doing into the same emotional space as the wanting. What changes, when things do eventually change, is not that the anxiety disappears. It's not that one day the tasks stop feeling heavy, or that the fear of exposure dissolves, or that perfectionism quietly packs its bags and leaves. None of that tends to happen cleanly. What changes for most people is something quieter and more gradual. They start to notice the gap between the list and the doing with a kind of curiosity rather than shame. They start to ask, what is this protecting me from right now? What would I have to feel if I actually began? They start to become interested in the texture of the avoidance rather than just frustrated by it. And when the avoidance becomes visible, when you can see it clearly enough to say, I'm planning again instead of starting again, and I wonder why, something shifts, not dramatically. Not all at once, but slightly. Enough. Because the list was never the enemy. The list was the signal. It was the thing your nervous system reached for when the doing felt too exposed, too uncertain, too full of the possibility of falling short. It was the place you put your desire to accomplish things when the accomplishing itself felt too dangerous. And once you understand that, the list stops being evidence of what you haven't done and starts being a map of what you want. And wanting things, clearly persistently, in neat handwriting or tiny digital font, is not something to be ashamed of. It's actually, when you look at it that way, a form of faith. There's one more thing worth saying, and it's about the nature of the tasks themselves. The things that stay on the list the longest, the tasks that migrate from page to page across months and sometimes years, are almost never the mundane ones. You call the dentist, you return the package, you send the quick email. Those things happen, imperfect and incomplete as your list-keeping may be. The tasks that linger are always the ones that carry more meaning than their surface description suggests. Work on the project is not just a task. It's a door into a room where your competence will be tested. Start the application is not just a form to fill out. It's the beginning of wanting something out loud, which means it's the beginning of the possibility of not getting it. Write the thing is not just writing. It's the exposure of something internal, the risk of being seen creating something that might not measure up to the thing you imagined when you wrote it on the list. The brain knows the difference. The brain has always known the difference. That's why those tasks stay. They are not undone because you forgot about them or because you don't care. They are undone because completing them requires a kind of emotional courage that the planning phase has been very carefully avoiding. And understanding that reframes everything. It means your list is not full of failures. It is full of the things that matter most to you. The tasks you can't quite start are almost always the tasks that are connected to who you most want to be. The list is not a record of your inadequacy. It is a record of your ambition. Most people who live inside this pattern eventually find some version of peace with it. Not because they become perfect completers, not because the anxiety evaporates and the lists start clearing and everything that needed to get done finally gets done, but because they stop reading the list as a verdict. The list remain. The planning still feels good. New notebooks still get opened. New apps still get downloaded. The tasks still have a way of accumulating faster than they get addressed. But the story attached to all of that slowly changes. The list stops meaning, I am someone who can't follow through, and it starts meaning, I am someone who carries a lot of things that feel large, and I have found a way to hold them that feels bearable. That is not a small thing. That is actually an enormous act of self-care that has been misread as self-sabotage for years. Your brain is not failing you when it reaches for the list. It is doing its job. It is moving you away from something that felt threatening and towards something that felt manageable. It is searching, constantly and persistently, for the ground beneath your feet. The lists are the proof that you never stopped trying, that even when nothing got finished, you kept returning, kept writing the tasks down, kept holding the belief somewhere underneath the guilt and the overwhelm that the things on the list were worth doing, that you were someone who could eventually do them. That belief is not naive. It is not a symptom. It is the most fundamental form of hope there is. The task can wait a little longer. It has been waiting. And you have been showing up in the way that you can, in the way that feels survivable, in the way that gets you to the next day with enough left to try again. That is not failure. That is resilience in a form that doesn't get celebrated nearly enough. And somewhere, in a notebook or an app, or on a folded piece of paper in a pocket you haven't checked in 3 days, there is a list that is the quietest possible evidence of that.